She didn't lose everything all at once. That's the cruelest part. She lost it piece by piece, while trusting the exact person handing it away. Picture this. A warm southern morning in Magnolia Ridge, and Zoe Carter is standing on a ladder, laughing, stretching to hang a hand-painted banner above the front door of her brand-new soul food cafe. The kind of laugh that comes from the belly, the kind that means you finally made it to the place you've been running toward your whole life. The morning smells like honeysuckle and fresh paint and possibility. Her grandmother's recipes are laminated on the menu. Her father's name is written in small letters near the bottom, in honor of Earl Carter, who never stopped believing. The door has a little bell above it, the kind that rings twice when someone walks in, like it's clapping for you. Now cut to 6 months later. Same door, same street, but the banner is gone. The windows are dark, and taped to the door, right where the hours of operation used to be, is a legal notice, stamped in cold black ink. Property dispute. City order. 30 days to respond or the deed transfers. Same woman. Same dream. Completely different world. Zoe stands on the sidewalk, holding the only thing she managed to grab before the locks were changed. Her grandmother's cookbook. Worn leather cover. Pages soft as skin. The handwriting inside so familiar it almost speaks out loud. Her grandmother had pressed it into her hands at the kitchen table at Christmas before she passed, said, "This is your inheritance, baby, more valuable than any land they'll ever try to take from you." Zoe hadn't understood that word, take, until right now, standing outside the cafe that was supposed to be her legacy, watching the morning light catch the gold lettering of her own name on a door she can no longer open. She is not just broke. She is not just in debt. She is hollowed out. The way a person gets when the thing they built doesn't just fall, but gets pulled out from underneath them while they were still standing on it. But here's what Zoe doesn't know yet. And here's what you need to know right now, because nothing that follows will make sense without it. That same morning, across town, Zoe's best friend Dana is sitting in a car with the engine off. Phone pressed her ear. Dana, warm, dependable Dana, who helped Zoe design the cafe logo, who stood in that kitchen at 2 a.m. tasting biscuits and crying happy tears when they got the recipe right. Dana is speaking quietly, calmly, to a man named Harlan Cross, a developer, old money, the kind of man who doesn't buy property. He absorbs it. And Dana is telling him, she still doesn't know. Keep the pressure on. We're close. She ends the call, looks at a photo of Zoe on her phone, and says absolutely nothing. For 8 months, before the cafe even opened, Dana has been feeding Harlan Cross everything he needed. She falsified the business license renewal. She tipped off the city inspector. She steered Zoe toward a bank that Cross had already spoken to. Every door that closed in Zoe's face, Dana had quietly locked from the inside, and in return, a cash payment, a stake in whatever luxury development replaces a cafe, and the kind of silence that only a certain breed of person can maintain while looking their best friend in the eye. You are watching something Zoe cannot see, and that feeling sitting in your chest right now, that tightening, that quiet fury, hold on to it, because this story is going to need it. Back on the sidewalk, Zoe's older brother Marcus pulls up in his pickup truck, takes one look at her face, and doesn't say a word. He just gets out of the car, wraps one arm around her shoulders, and stands there with her. That's Marcus, steady as timber, the kind of man who shows up before you ask. Their father called that evening, tried to sound calm while quietly offering his pension savings to cover Zoe's rent for the month. "We'll fight this," he told her. "This family has survived worse than city notice." Zoe nodded into the phone. She believed him, because she had always believed in the people who loved her. And that belief, that enormous, beautiful, completely misplaced belief, is the most dangerous thing she owns right now. That same week, a stranger drives into Magnolia Ridge in a rented car that doesn't quite fit the town. Harrison Caldwell, celebrated chef, Michelin stars. The kind of polish that comes from never having had to apologize for anything. He's here to open a farm-to-table restaurant, chasing the authenticity and the southern warmth he remembers from childhood. He doesn't expect much. He certainly doesn't expect her. He finds Zoe at the Saturday market, still showing up still selling her grandmother's preserves and cornbread from a folding table with a gingham cloth, as if the world hasn't just tried to swallow her whole. There is something in the way she carries herself, unbothered by his money, unimpressed by his name, that stops him mid-step. He fumbles. She corrects him with a look that costs her nothing and costs him everything. He lingers. She notices. And something shifts in the space between them, something neither one of them is prepared to name yet. But before anything between them can grow, before Zoe can fight back, before the truth about Dana can surface, the clock is already running. Harlan Cross has already filed his paperwork. The city has already been paid. And Zoe Carter, standing at her market table with her grandmother's cookbook in her bag and a cautious smile forming for a man she doesn't yet know she needs. She has 30 days, and she doesn't know it yet. So here's the question that should keep you up tonight. If the person holding the knife looks exactly like the person holding your hand, how long before you feel the cut? There is a particular kind of silence that follows a woman who is losing everything and doesn't know why. Not the silence of giving up. Zoe Carter hadn't learned how to do that yet. No, this was the silence of a person standing in the middle of a burning house, searching for fire and finding nothing but smoke. Everything looked normal. Everything felt wrong. And the most dangerous part? The match had already been struck 8 months ago by someone who knew exactly where Zoe kept her kindling. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because before the fire becomes visible, there's the unbearable business of watching someone walk straight into it with a smile on their face. It was Dana who suggested the appeal. Of course it was Dana. 3 days after the legal notice appeared on the cafe door, Zoe was sitting at her kitchen table surrounded by paperwork, trying to make sense of city codes and licensing documentation that seemed to shift every time she read them. When Dana arrived with coffee, a yellow legal pad, and the kind of focused energy that looks identical to loyalty if you don't know what you're really looking at. She sat across from Zoe, clicked her pen, and said, "We are not going to let them do this. We file an appeal. Today. Together." And Zoe, who had spent 3 days feeling like she was trying to bail out a sinking boat with her bare hands, felt something loosen in her chest. Because that's what Dana did. That's what she had always done. She arrived exactly when the weight became unbearable, and she made it feel shared. She made Zoe feel less alone in the wreckage of her own life. What Zoe couldn't see, what she had no reason to see, was the way Dana's eyes moved when she handed over completed appeal form. Just a flicker, the briefest hesitation before she slid the papers across the table. A pause so small it would disappear completely in a memory, but would later feel, in retrospect, like a knife being positioned. Because Dana had already filled out the appeal. She had filled out carefully, thoroughly, and then submitted it to the wrong department with a bureaucratic error so minor and so precise that it would take 3 weeks for anyone to notice. 3 weeks that Harlan Cross had paid for. The appeal was dead before Zoe signed her name. But Zoe didn't know that. She thanked Dana. She hugged her. She poured the coffee Dana brought and sat back down at her kitchen table feeling, for the first time in 3 days, like she might actually survive this. And across town, in a parked car outside a coffee shop, Dana texted Harlan Cross 4 words. Appeal filed. Clock running. Now ask yourself something. How many times in your life have you thanked someone who was robbing you? How many times has someone's kindness arrived at exactly the right moment, and that timing, that perfect, generous timing, been the very thing that should have made you suspicious? Zoe Carter was not a naive woman. She had grown up in Magnolia Ridge, which meant she had grown up understanding that the world did not always arrange itself in her favor. She had learned early to read a room, to sense when a compliment had a hidden floor to it, to identify the particular smile that preceded a slight. She had armor. She had instincts. She had been fooled by strangers before and recovered. What she hadn't accounted for, what almost no one ever accounts for, is that the instincts we build to protect ourselves from enemies are nearly useless against friends. Because the armor we wear faces outward. We leave the back door open for the people we love. And Dana had been standing at that back door for years. Meanwhile, across town, something else was beginning. Something quieter. Something that didn't announce itself with coffee and a yellow legal pad, but arrived instead in small, almost accidental moments at a gingham-covered market table. Harrison Caldwell had told himself he was coming back to the market for the cornbread. That's what he said to himself, in the mirror of his rented room at the Magnolia Ridge Inn, straightening his collar with particular care of a man trying not to admit he's trying. The cornbread. He was a chef. He had professional reasons to be interested in regional recipes. This was research. This was absolutely, completely, 100% professional. He arrived at Zoe's table 12 minutes before the market opened. She was arranging peach preserves in diagonal line when she heard him clear his throat, looked up, and said nothing for exactly 3 seconds, which is, if you've ever been on the receiving end of that particular silence, a very long time. Then she said, "You're early." And he said, "I wanted to beat the crowd." And she looked around the entirely empty market and said, "What crowd?" And Harrison Caldwell, who had cooked for seated dinners of 400 people without blinking, laughed and looked at his shoes. Something was happening. Neither of them was talking about it, which made it more real, not less. Over the days that followed, Harrison found reasons to be wherever Zoe was. He told himself each reason separately, so he didn't have to look at them all at once. He needed to understand regional ingredients. He was curious about family recipe traditions. He was building a menu. He was doing research. He was completely and thoroughly distracted by a woman who corrected him without apology, who laughed like the sound came from somewhere deep and unguarded, who carried grief inside her shoulders but refused to let it reach her eyes. One evening, after the market closed, Harrison asked Zoe about her grandmother, not about the recipes, about the woman, and Zoe, who had become accustomed to people wanting the food without the story, paused for a moment and then told him. She told him about a woman who had cooked every Sunday for 40 years without once consulting a recipe, who had fed neighbors and strangers and anyone who arrived at the door looking like they needed something warm, who had pressed a worn cookbook into her granddaughter's hands, not because the recipes were secrets, but because the love behind them needed to be carried forward by someone capable of understanding its weight. Harrison listened in the way that Zoe had not been listened to in a long time, not nodding along, not waiting for his turn to speak. Actually listening, the way a person listens when what they're hearing is rearranging something inside them. And Zoe, who had spent years perfecting the polite smile that kept people at a comfortable distance, felt the first small crack appear in the wall she had built so carefully around herself. But here is where the story tightens, because while Zoe was allowing herself a fragile and cautious hope in the cafe, in the appeal, in the man who showed up 12 minutes early and looked at his shoes when she caught him, Day 7 became Day 14, and the city had not responded to the appeal. Dana assured her this was normal. Bureaucracy moves slow. You know that, she said, squeezing Zoe's hand over the kitchen table. Be patient. Trust the process. Trust the process. Trust Dana. Trust that the world, for once, was going to fall on the right side. Day 14 became Day 22. And on Day 22, a man named Harlan Cross filed a legal claim of property abandonment on Zoe's Café. The document arrived on a Thursday afternoon, slid to the mail slot of Zoe's apartment with the quiet indifference of a legal system that does not understand what it's carrying. Zoe picked it up from the floor, read the first line, and sat down on the bottom stair of her hallway because her legs decided, independently, that they were done standing. The claim stated that the property had been commercially inactive for more than 60 days, that the original licensing had lapsed due to administrative non-renewal, and that under City Ordinance 17-4, the deed was eligible for transfer to a qualified developer within 30 days of the filing date. 30 days. After which, the cafe, the building, the address, the corner of Magnolia and 4th Street that her family had owned for 3 generations, would be gone. Not damaged. Not temporarily closed. Gone. Transferred. Absorbed into whatever steel and glass monument Harlan Cross had already drawn up in blueprints that probably didn't include a single magnolia tree or a single family whose name deserved to be above the door. And the clock, the one that had been running without her knowledge since Day 1, was now visible, loud, inescapable. Dana arrived within the hour. Of course she did. She was there with her yellow legal pad and her focused energy and her coffee and her, "This is outrageous. We are going to fight this. I am not leaving your side." And Zoe held on to those words the way a drowning person holds onto something that looks like a rope, without stopping to check what the other end is tied to. Now stop for just a moment, because I need you to hold two images in your mind at the same time. Hold the image of Zoe, sitting at her kitchen table with her brother Marcus on one side and Dana on the other, making lists of lawyers and city contacts and community supporters, her jaw set and her hands steady even though everything inside her is shaking. Hold that image. Now hold this one. Dana, in the bathroom of Zoe's apartment, door locked, whispering into her phone that the filing was received, that Zoe was shaken but still fighting, that they needed to make sure the right lawyers declined the case, that Cross needed to keep his bank contact in place for just a little longer. She ends the call, flushes the toilet for the sound of it, runs a tap, and walks back out to the kitchen table where Zoe is waiting. She sits down. She picks up her pen. She says, "Okay, first, we need a lawyer." The first firm Zoe called said they had a conflict of interest. The second said they were at capacity. The third said her case, while compelling, was outside their area of practice. The fourth didn't call back at all. Zoe didn't know that Harlan Cross's development company had two partners with financial ties to the first firm, had made a significant donation to the second, and had quietly communicated, through channels that don't leave paper trails, that this particular property matter was not one that needed outside legal interference. The doors didn't close on their own. They were closed, one, by hand she couldn't see. Marcus, who trusted numbers more than words, had started pulling public records in the evenings after work, land transfers, developer filings, city council voting histories on zoning requests. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. He just had the feeling that a man doesn't file a legal abandonment claim on a cafe that had been open for 6 months without having planned the ending before the story started. Marcus was the kind of man who believed that the truth was always in the paperwork. You just had to be willing to read everything, including the pages that were supposed to be boring. He flagged 3 things he didn't understand yet. He put them in a folder. He said nothing to Zoe, not because he wanted to keep secrets, but because he refused to bring her more weight until he was sure what he was carrying. And Harrison, who had told himself he was here for cornbread and research and professional development, was starting to feel the shape of something he couldn't name. He had grown up in this town. He knew its rhythms, its gossip, its architecture of power, who sat at which table in which restaurant, and what that meant about what they owned and who they controlled. He knew that a man like Harlan Cross didn't materialize from nowhere with completed legal filing and a development plan that was clearly already in motion. That kind of precision took time. That kind of confidence took certainty. And you only get that certain about a legal outcome if the outcome was arranged before the process began. One afternoon, Harrison ran into the city building inspector at the hardware store. They had gone to school together, not friends, but familiar. They talked for 12 minutes in the plumbing aisle about nothing in particular. But when Harrison mentioned Zoe's Café, casually like it was small talk, the inspector got very quiet and very busy looking at pipe fittings and said, "That's a complicated situation," and changed the subject. Harrison watched the man's hands. They weren't still. He didn't say anything to Zoe. Not yet. But that evening he called in a favor from a contact in the city records office, a quiet, careful favor, and asked for everything filed in connection with the cafe property in the last 12 months. While all of this was circling beneath the surface, Zoe was still moving. That was the thing about Zoe Carter that the story needs you to understand. She did not stop. She could not afford to stop. She went back to her market table every Saturday. She sold her grandmother's preserves and her cornbread and her sweet tea, and she smiled at customers and answered questions and folded her fear into the back of her chest where it wouldn't show. She applied for 2 small business emergency grants. She wrote 3 letters to city council members. She called in every favor she had accumulated in 32 years of living in Magnolia Ridge, and she held on to hope the way her grandmother had taught her, not as a feeling, but as a discipline, as a daily practice, as a choice made every morning before the weight of the day had a chance to make you choose otherwise. Harrison watched her do this, and something that had been closed inside him for a long time, something he hadn't known needed to be open, began to move. He showed up at her market table on a Tuesday, which was not a market day. She raised an eyebrow. He said he had been thinking about her grandmother's biscuit recipe and whether she'd be willing to walk him through the technique. She studied him for 3 full seconds and then said, "You came on a Tuesday. For biscuits?" He said yes. She looked at him for 1 more second, then said, "Come back Thursday. And bring your own flour. I'm not feeding your curiosity out of my supplies." He was back on Thursday with 2 bags of flour and an expression that could only be described as quietly hopeful. That evening in Zoe's kitchen, Marcus at the counter pretending to read the paper, their father's old radio playing something slow from the other room. Harrison attempted biscuit dough with the focused intensity of a man who had cooked in professional kitchens for 15 years and was being thoroughly humbled by someone's grandmother's technique. He overworked the dough. Zoe corrected him without ceremony. He tried again. She watched his hands and said, "Lighter, you're not punishing it." He laughed. A real laugh. The kind that surprised him. And she turned away quickly so he wouldn't see that the laugh had surprised her too. For a few hours, in the warm light of that kitchen, something heavy lifted. Zoe allowed herself to feel it. The lightness, the possibility, the dangerous and wonderful idea that maybe the story wasn't over, that maybe there was still room in her life for something other than fighting. And then she checked her phone. 14 days left. The lightness folded back up. The weight returned. And Zoe Carter, who had been taught that hope was a discipline, made herself practice it 1 more time. But here's what you need to know about hope when it lives alongside betrayal. It doesn't protect you. It just makes the wound deeper when it finally arrives, because the betrayal was still coming, and it was building to something public and ugly and designed to look like its opposite. With 11 days left on the clock, Dana organized a community support dinner for Zoe. She booked the church hall, designed the flyers herself, called every person in their shared social circle, and framed the entire event as a fundraiser for Zoe's legal defense. The hall was full. The food was good. The energy in the room was the particular warmth of a community that feels guilty about not having shown up sooner and is overcompensating in casseroles and folding tables. Zoe sat at the center of it all looking genuinely moved because the room was full of people she loved and had grown up with, and because the sight of that many faces turned toward her in support was the closest thing to solid ground she'd felt in weeks. Dana stood at the front of the room and gave a speech about Zoe's courage, her family's legacy, the injustice of what was happening. Her voice broke, which was an excellent touch. People wiped their eyes. Several people handed Dana envelopes with cash. Dana thanked them personally, holding the envelopes with both hands, pressing them to her chest like they were precious. Zoe never saw those envelopes again. Not $1 from that fundraiser reached Zoe's legal defense. Dana deposited it into a personal account 3 days later, citing, in a message across, additional expenses. The community thought they had helped. Zoe thought they had helped. The only person who knew they hadn't was a person standing at the front of the room with tears in her eyes and envelopes pressed to her chest like a promise. And Harrison, standing in the back of that church hall, watching Dana work the room with the smooth efficiency of someone who has done this before, felt the shape of the thing he'd been circling for weeks finally come clear. He had seen the records from his city contact. He had found the misfiled appeal, the wrong department, the precise bureaucratic error that was too clean to be accidental. He had cross-referenced Dana's name against the city inspector's filing history and found a connection that was 1 degree removed but present, definitely, undeniably present. He had the shape of it now. He didn't have all the details, but he had enough. He watched Dana hug Zoe at the end of the night. He watched Zoe hold on. And Harrison Caldwell, who had grown up in a world that had given him every advantage and had still somehow managed to teach him nothing about other people's pain until a woman with peach preserves and a dead grandmother's cookbook showed him what he'd been missing, felt something cold and decided to settle in his chest. Not anger. Something more useful than anger. He left the church hall quietly. He sat in his car for a long time, and then he made 3 phone calls. The first was to his media contact in Atlanta, a journalist who covered real estate corruption and had been looking for an in on Cross's development company for 2 years. The second was to a property lawyer who had been disbarred in another county and then reinstated, who had a particular talent for finding fraud indeed transfer filings, and a particular hatred for Harlan Cross that predated the situation by a decade. The third call was to Marcus. Marcus answered on the first ring. Harrison said, "I know what happened. I have documents. But we need to be careful. We need to build a full case before Zoe finds out. Because if she finds out now, she'll try to fight herself, and Dana will see her coming." There was a long silence on the other end. Then Marcus said, "How long do we have?" Harrison looked at the calendar on his phone. 9 days. Another silence. Then Marcus said, "Tell me everything." And so the pieces began to move, quietly, strategically in the dark, in the direction of justice, while Zoe Carter went home from her own fundraiser believing, for the first time in weeks, that maybe things were turning around. She sat on her porch swing in the warm night air, holding her grandmother's cookbook against her chest, listening to the peepers in the trees. She thought about Harrison's laugh in her kitchen. She thought about Marcus's steadiness and her father's quiet sacrifice in a room full of people who had shown up for her. She thought about her grandmother, who had cooked for 40 years without consulting a recipe, because some things, once learned in the right way, become part of you. She did not know that 9 days stood between her and the moment her best friend would be exposed on a stage, in public, in front of everyone who had just watched her cry and give a speech about courage. She did not know that the man she was cautiously, reluctantly, terrifiedly beginning to feel something for was at that precise moment sitting in a parked car building the architecture of her rescue without her knowledge. She did not know that the clock she thought was running against her was, in fact, about to be turned against the people who had wound it. She only knew the night air was warm. The cookbook was solid in her arms. And somewhere, improbably in the middle of all of this, she was still here, still standing, still breathing, still hoping, which, when you think about it, was exactly what Dana had been counting on, because you can only steal from someone who still has something to lose. And here's the question that should sit with you right now, before we cross into the final act where everything comes apart and comes back together in ways that will cost everyone something they weren't expecting to pay. When someone builds your trust with one hand and dismantles your life with the other, is the love you felt for them real? Does the truth of what they did erase the truth of what you felt? And when justice finally arrives, will it feel like winning? Or will it just feel like the particular, quiet grief of having loved someone who was never what you thought they were? Hold that question, because in the final act, every single one of those answers is coming, and none of them are simple. Here's the thing about justice that nobody tells you. It doesn't arrive the way you imagine it. You spend weeks, maybe months, picturing it as something loud and sudden, a door kicked open, a light flooding a dark room all at once. But the truth is that real justice, the kind that actually holds, the kind that means something long after the moment passes, is built quietly in the dark by people who are tired and grieving and still choosing to show up anyway. It doesn't announce itself. It assembles, piece by piece, document by document, phone call by phone call, until the moment it is ready, and then, only then, does it step into the light. 9 days. That was all Harrison and Marcus had. And so, this is the question that opens the final chapter of Zoe Carter's story. Not whether justice is coming, because it is. You can feel it gather in the air the way you feel a storm before the sky changes color, but whether the people she loves can build it fast enough and clean enough and strong enough to make it count before everything she has left is taken from her permanently. 9 days. Let's count them down. Harrison had the documents spread across the small desk in his room at the Magnolia Ridge in printed, cross-referenced, color-coded and precise, methodical way a man who channels everything he cannot yet say into the thing he can actually do. The misfiled appeal was there. The city inspector's connection to Dana was there, 1 degree removed but traceable, documented in a vendor payment log that had no business existing, and existed anyway, because arrogant people cut corners they don't think anyone will ever look at. The timeline was there, 8 months of coordinated action that began before Zoe had even hung her grandmother's first recipe on the Café wall. And underneath all of it, patient and damning, were the financial records that Marcus had pulled from public filings, a series of payments from a Harlan Cross subsidiary to a personal LLC registered 6 months ago in Dana's mother's name. Dana had not been careful. She had been confident, and confidence when it sits in the wrong chest, has a way of making a person sloppy in exactly the places that matter. Marcus sat across from Harrison at that small desk, reading the documents in the order Harrison handed them to him, saying nothing until he reached the last page. Then he set it down, looked at the wall for a long moment, and said, "She's been in our house. She sat at our table." Harrison didn't answer, because there was nothing to say to that. Some truths don't need a response. They just need to be witnessed. They worked through the night. The journalist Renee Coles, Atlanta-based, 2 years of documented research on Cross's development portfolio, and a professional fury that had been looking for exactly this kind of opening, was on a call with them by midnight. She had her own documents. She had sources inside Cross's company who had been waiting for someone to build enough of a case to make coming forward safe. When Harrison walked her through what he and Marcus had assembled, she went quiet for a long moment and then said, "This is it. This is a thread." Harrison said, "Can you be in Magnolia Ridge in 6 days?" She said, "I can be there in 4. The property lawyer, a sharp, battle-worn man named Gerald Fitch, who had been trying to dismantle Harlan Cross's business practices since a land dispute in another county 7 years ago left 3 families homeless and Cross richer by a margin that should have been criminal and wasn't, at least not on paper. Reviewed the deed transfer filing and found we called a cascade of procedural fraud. The misfiled appeal meant the 30-day clock had never legally started. The abandonment claim was built on falsified licensing records. The entire legal structure Cross had erected around Zoe's property was, in Fitch's words, a house of cards in a windstorm. The moment you pull one card, the rest come down together. They had a case, a real one, the kind that holds. But they needed the public moment, because a case that gets filed quietly, that gets resolved in a courthouse with no witnesses, does not protect Zoe, not from Cross's reach, not from Dana's continued presence in her life. It resolves the legal issue without resolving the truth. And Zoe Carter had lived her whole life in a town where the truth mattered, where it was spoken out loud, in public, in front of people who had to sit with what they'd witnessed. She deserved the public truth. She had earned it, so they planned for it, deliberately, carefully, with the cool precision of people who understood that the most important moment in this story could not be rushed or fumbled or left to chance. Here was a plan, and it was elegant in a way that only necessary things are elegant. Not ornate, not complicated, just exactly sufficient for what it needed to do. Cross had scheduled a public press conference in the town square for day 30. He had already told the local paper it would be an announcement about a major development project, a gift to the community, a revitalization effort. He had a podium. He had invitations. He had Dana confirmed to stand beside him as a community liaison, a role she had apparently agreed to accept, which told you everything you needed to know about how certain they both were that this was already over. They believed the story had been written. They were just showing up for the last page. They had no idea that someone had already rewritten the ending. Marcus was registered as a community speaker for the open public portion of the event, a routine civic formality that Cross's team had barely glanced at, because why would you scrutinize the guest list when you control the stage? Renee Coles would be in the crowd with a camera crew, credentialed as press covering the development announcement, which she was just not the version of the story Cross was expecting her to tell. Gerald Fitch had filed an emergency injunction the morning of the event, timed to be served during the press conference itself, making the deed transfer legally unenforceable the moment it was attempted. The documents, all of them clean and complete, were loaded onto a laptop connected to the projection screen that Cross's own team had set up in the town square for his announcement. Every piece was in place, but there was still Zoe. Harrison had wrestled with this, the question of how long to keep her in the dark, more than he'd wrestled with anything else in this entire situation, and that included his own discomfort with what the process had revealed about him and his assumptions, and a particular brand of blindness that comes from never having had to fight for something the way Zoe had been fighting her whole life. He knew that keeping her uninformed, even for the right reasons, was a form of the same thing he was trying to help her escape. Someone else making decisions about her story without her consent. He knew it. It sat in him like a stone. But he also knew Zoe. He had been watching her for weeks with the attention of a man who was learning some of the way he learned a new cuisine, carefully, respectfully, aware that there is always more depth than the surface suggests. And what he knew about Zoe was this. She would fight. If she knew what Dana had done, she would confront her. She would not be able to help it, because Zoe Carter did not process betrayal quietly. She processed it honestly, which meant out loud, which meant Dana would see it coming, and everything they had built would collapse before it could be used. So Harrison made a decision, and he knew it would cost him. He accepted that. On day 28, he found Zoe at her market table in the late afternoon, the crowd thinning, the light going golden the way it does in that particular southern hour that makes everything look like a memory while it's still happening. He didn't tell her about the plan. He didn't tell her about Dana. He sat beside her on the bench where they had first talked, and he said, "I need you to trust me for 2 more days. Come to the town square on Thursday. Bring Marcus. Bring your father if he wants to come. And whatever happens, don't react until it's over." Zoe looked at him for a long time. The kind of look that is actually a series of questions arriving faster than words can carry them. Then she said, "Harrison, what do you know?" And he said, "Enough. And I'm going to make sure you know all of it, publicly, the way you deserve to." She studied him. She was not a woman who trusted easily, and he knew that, and he was asking her to do the hard thing, to extend him the same costly, disciplined hope she extended every morning to her own life. He understood what he was asking. He held her gaze and let her read whatever she needed to read in his face. She said finally, "If you're wrong about this, or if you're playing me, I will never forgive you." He said, "I know." She said, 2 days. He nodded. She picked up her grandmother's cookbook from under the table. She had taken to carrying it with her, the way some people carry photographs of the people they're fighting for. And she walked away without looking back. Harrison watched her go. Then he went back to the inn and didn't sleep. Day 30 arrived the way final days always do, too quickly, without ceremony, wearing the face of an ordinary morning. The town square of Magnolia Ridge filled up slowly through the late morning. People drifting in the way small-town people drift toward public events. Not quite sure what they're there for, but certain they should be present for it. Cross's team had set up a small stage, a podium with a microphone, the projection screen, folding chairs arranged in neat rows. There were refreshments. There were people from the city council. There were handshakes and backslapping and the general atmosphere of a conclusion being celebrated before it's been announced. Harlan Cross arrived at 11:15 in a dark car, wearing a suit that had been made for him specifically, moving through the square with the unhurried confidence of a man who has never, in his professional life, walked into a room he didn't own. Dana arrived 2 minutes later and stood at the edge of the stage looking exactly as she always looked, composed, warm, ready. She scanned the crowd, found Zoe in the 3rd row, and smiled. Zoe smiled back. And here, right here, is the moment this story asks you to hold your breath. Because Zoe Carter, sitting in the 3rd row of her own public humiliation, smiling at the woman who had spent 8 months dismantling her life piece by careful piece, was not doing it out of ignorance anymore. She had spent 36 hours with the full weight of Harrison's trust me pressing against every instinct she had ever developed for self-protection. She did not know the details. She did not know the documents or the plan or the injunction. She just knew that Harrison had asked her to hold still for 2 days, and she had made a decision, not a comfortable one, not a simple one, to believe him. That decision, that small and enormous act of faith, was the bravest thing Zoe Carter had done in a story full of brave things. Cross stepped to the podium. He thanked the city council. He thanked the community. He spoke about revitalization and investment and the future of Magnolia Ridge. He used the word legacy 4 times, which was either deeply ironic or deeply unconscious, and it is difficult to say which would be worse. He gestured to the projection screen, where an architect's rendering of the new development appeared, glass and steel, and not a magnolia tree in sight. He spoke about the property on the corner of Magnolia and 4th Street with the careful neutrality of a man describing something he has already decided belongs to him. Then he invited community speakers. And Marcus Carter walked to the microphone. He didn't rush. He stood at the podium the way their father stood at things, with the quiet, rooted steadiness of a man whose ground cannot be moved because he chose it deliberately. He said, "My name is Marcus Carter. My family has owned property on the corner of Magnolia and 4th Street for 3 generations, and I have some documents I'd like to share with this community. He nodded to the back of the crowd, where Renee Coles's crew was already live. He nodded to the laptop operator, Gerald Fitch's assistant, who was sitting in the second row, and the projection screen behind cross-changed. The architect's rendering disappeared. In its place, Dana's phone records, the LLC in her mother's name, the payment logs from Cross's subsidiary, the misfiled appeal, highlighted, annotated, the wrong department circled in red, the city inspector's vendor connection, the timeline, 8 months of it, clean and documented and projected in public, in daylight, in front of every person in Magnolia Ridge who had eaten casserole at a fundraiser and handed Dana an envelope believing it would reach Zoe's legal defense. The square went silent in a particular way that only happens when a large group of people receives information that rearranges everything they thought they understood. Cross moved first, toward the laptop, toward the projection screen, the smooth confidence evaporating so completely and so quickly that what replaced it was almost unrecognizable. His lawyer was on a phone at the edge of the stage. 2 city officials stepped back from him visibly, in real time, on camera. Renee Coles was moving through the crowd, crew behind her, professional and precise. And then there was Dana. Dana, who had spent 8 months being the most reliable person in any room she entered. Dana, who had cried at a podium about courage and injustice and the importance of community. Dana, who had pressed other people's money to her chest like it was precious and deposited it 3 days later into her own account. Dana, standing at the edge of the stage with the expression of a person watching a building they constructed fall, floor by floor, in real time, unable to stop it, unable to look away. She turned, and Zoe was standing directly behind her. How long had Zoe been standing there? Long enough. She had risen from the third row, quietly, the moment Marcus stepped a microphone, and crossed the distance between them without anyone noticing, because everyone was watching the screen. She was not shaking. She was not crying. She was standing with the stillness of a woman who has processed something completely and come out the other side of it into a place that is too deep for tears and too real for rage. She was just present, looking at Dana with the full, unguarded weight of 32 years of friendship and 8 months of invisible destruction. Dana opened her mouth. Zoe held up one hand. Not a gesture of anger, just a quiet, final signal that said, "There is nothing you can say here that is worth my time." Then she turned away, once, and walked toward her father, who was standing at the back of the crowd with his hands clasped in front of him and tears running silently down his face. Gerald Fitch's injunction was served to Cross's lawyer at 11:47. The deed transfer was suspended pending fraud investigation. Within 48 hours, a formal criminal inquiry was opened into Cross's development company, the falsified licensing records, and the payments to Dana's LLC. By the end of the week, 3 city officials had agreed to cooperate with investigators. Renee Coles' story ran in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and was picked up nationally by Tuesday. Harlan Cross's development company filed for emergency legal protection on Wednesday. It didn't help. Dana did not reach out to Zoe. There was nothing to say. That silence, Zoe later told Marcus, was actually the most honest thing Dana had done in almost a year. And then, slowly, the way a wound closes when it's been properly cleaned and given the conditions it needs to heal, Magnolia Ridge began to breathe again. The property deed was returned to the Carter family within 30 days, legally clean, every procedural irregularity reversed and documented. The city issued a formal apology, brief, bureaucratic, insufficient, but present. The community, which had watched the whole thing happen in the town square and would be processing for years, showed up for Zoe in the way communities show up when they are ashamed of their silence and ready to trade it for something better. Not with fanfare, with presence. With the quiet, daily, unglamorous work of actually showing up, bringing supplies, volunteering time, helping to strip and repaint the cafe walls, arriving on a Tuesday morning with a ladder and a question, "Where do you need me?" The cafe reopened on a Saturday. Of course it did. Saturdays in Magnolia Ridge were for the market and for gathering and for a particular kind of joy that comes from choosing to celebrate in a place that tried to take something from you. Zoe stood in the kitchen of her grandmother's legacy, her cafe, her name above the door, her family's recipes on the menu with full credit and full story. and she cooked. She cooked the way her grandmother had cooked, without consulting anything, because some things, once learned the right way, become part of you. Harrison was there, not behind a podium or beside a microphone. He was at the back counter, out of the way, pretending to arrange things that didn't need arranging, which was what he did when he was trying not to let his face show too much. He had not pushed, had not asked for credit or gratitude or resolution of the complicated, unfinished thing that existed between them. He had understood instinctively that the most important thing he could offer Zoe Carter right now was exactly what it failed to offer in the beginning: space to define her own story on her own terms. She found him at that back counter late in the afternoon, after the lunch rush and before the dinner crowd, in the particular quiet of a kitchen that has been well used and is resting between performances. She stood in front of him with her apron still on and flour on her forearm and said, "You kept me in the dark." He said, "I know. I'm sorry." She said, "Don't make decisions for me again." He said, "I won't." And she studied him, the way she had studied him at the market table that first Tuesday, that non-market day, when he'd shown up 12 minutes early for biscuits and looked at his shoes. And she said, "You did a good thing." He said, "You deserved it." She said, "Yes, I did." It was not a fairy tale ending. It was better than that. It was a real one. Months passed with the quiet momentum of a life being rebuilt on foundations that have been tested and held. The Café thrived, not because it was discovered by the right people or featured in the right publication, though both of those things happened, but because it was real, because the food carried a story, and the story was true, and people can always tell the difference between something made for them and something made for the love of it. Zoe's grandmother's recipes fed Magnolia Ridge and kept feeding it, and in the eating of them, the story of the woman who made them continued, which is, when you think about it, exactly what she intended when she pressed that worn leather cookbook into her granddaughter's hands and said, "This is your inheritance, baby." On a spring morning, months after the cafe reopened, Zoe sat under the ancient magnolia tree in the town square, the same square where everything had come apart and come back together, with her newborn daughter in her arms. The baby was new to the world, still figuring out what light was, still deciding what she thought about the sound of voices and the feeling of morning air. Harrison sat beside Zoe on the bench. He wasn't performing anything. He wasn't managing anything. He was just there in the quiet, in the ordinary and extraordinary fact of being present for something that mattered. Zoe opened the cookbook across her knee with one hand, the baby in the other arm. She turned to the first page, the page her grandmother had written on before any recipe, before any instruction, before any of the accumulated wisdom of 40 years of feeding people with love. For the one brave enough to keep going. Zoe read the words. She had read them 100 times. They felt different now, not because the words had changed, but because she had. She had kept going. She had kept going through grief and betrayal, and a 30-day countdown, and particular, corrosive weight of discovering that someone she loved had been dismantling her life with a smile on their face. She had kept going through all of it, and she had come out the other side not diminished but deepened, carrying more than she had before, and stronger for the weight of it. She traced the words with her finger. The magnolia tree moved above her in the morning breeze. Her daughter made a small sound and resettled in her arms. Harrison reached over and turned the page gently to the first recipe, the biscuits, her grandmother's handwriting slanting upward the way it always did, like the words were trying to get somewhere. Zoe smiled, not for the town, not for anyone watching, for herself, because she had always believed that this was possible, this exact thing, this exact moment, this precise quality of peace, and the world had spent a considerable amount of effort trying to convince her otherwise, and she had been right, and it had been wrong, and here she was, still here, still standing, still the woman her grandmother wrote that inscription for, and that, finally, is the whole story. Now here's what I want from you, because you've been with Zoe through every single one of those 30 days, through the grief and the fury and the ticking clock and the moment justice stepped into the light, in a town square in Magnolia Ridge. And that means this story belongs to you a little bit now, too. So tell me, in the comments right now, who is the Dana in this story for you? Not necessarily someone who betrayed you, but the person you trusted completely, The one whose presence made the weight feel shared. The one you would have believed in even if someone tried to warn you. We all have one. We've all been Zoe at a kitchen table, signing a form someone else already decided was going nowhere. What did you do when you found out? How long did it take you to walk away? Leave it below, because the most important conversations that happen around a story like this are not the ones between the characters. They are the ones between people who recognize themselves in the telling. And if this story moved you, if it made you feel something real, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Because somewhere right now, there's a woman standing outside a shuttered door, holding the only thing she managed to grab. And she needs to know that the story doesn't end there. It never ends there. It just hasn't gotten to the good part yet.